Good afternoon, everyone. This is David Elzinga from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and we are now starting the Energy Technology Perspectives 2015 webinar. We're going to be talking today to a number of the experts who have been involved in the production of this application, and myself, I'm the former project manager of this publication. The first thing that I want to do is I want to turn it over to Jean-Francois Gagnier, the head of the Energy Technology Policy Division with the IEA, to offer some words of introduction. So welcome to everybody, and Jean-Francois, I want to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all those who are with us today. Very happy to realize the vast amount of turnout for this presentation of what is the IEA's second flagship publication. The Energy Technology Perspectives project is the focal area for the IEA's vast amount of activities that take place looking at the role that energy technologies can play in terms of meeting energy policy objectives, but also a lot of the work that we do in terms of fostering international collaboration through our network of energy technology initiatives. And so it's with great pride that today we will be presenting the second edition that we are publishing under a new vision for the Energy Technology Perspectives project, where we've gone from a bi-yearly global overview of the state of play in terms of energy technologies globally, but now are focusing on thematic aspects of the transition to a sustainable energy system. Last year, through our first edition within this new format, we addressed the great potential that electricity plays in all our scenarios in terms of an energy carrier, and the opportunities that were provided by that increased reliance on electricity to enable a sustainable energy transition. This year, in light of the great meeting that will take place at the end of this year in Paris in terms of addressing what actions that need to be taken to maintain climate change under control, we have decided to really take a good look at how energy technology innovation can be spurred and guided to really deliver the solutions that we need to enable increased ambitions in terms of climate change mitigation. And this is not the last aspects that we're going to be looking, because as we've seen quite a bit of success in terms of having this special look, and we are already working with many collaborators on the next edition, which will be focusing on how cities and local governments can help meet national policy ambitions through the building of sustainable cities and sustainable urban energy systems. But today what we will be doing is we will be having a deep dive in terms of the analysis of this year's publication. There will be a series of experts who have been authoring specific aspects of the book, giving detailed presentations on the findings of this year's book, and also giving some of the policy recommendations that stem out of this analysis. We are certainly hopeful that this information will be quite useful to all of you, will stir new ideas in terms of how we can continue to collaborate in pushing technologies further and enabling a sustainable energy transition, but also will entice you to collaborate with us as we continue to refine our analysis and want to make it as useful as possible. So we are we'll be welcoming feedback from attendees and hopefully creating new ways of working together. So without further ado, I will turning back to David Elzinga, who, as he mentioned, is the original project manager for this publication, also authored quite a bit of the content, so knows this very well, and will be guiding us through the book with interventions from the different authors. So Dave, thank you, and back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Jean-Francois. So I'm going to offer a few introductory remarks today, and then we're going to get into the meat of the topic. So as I formerly worked with the International Energy Agency and have just moved on to the UN Economic Commission for Europe, or the UNECE, and continue to work in sustainable energy in the context of one of the UN's regional commissions. So I've worked on energy technology perspectives since the 2010 edition. There were two previous editions. The first one came out in 2016. But as Jean-Francois mentioned, have led the 2014 and 2015 editions. And this continues to act as a foundation for the work that I do that has now moved on to more developing and emerging economies. Truly, working on the ETP has been a highlight to my career, and especially working with all the experts, some of whom you will hear today. There is always a rigorous debate, I would say even argument, a passionate argument, and ultimately analysis on where the energy system is heading and why it's heading in that direction. But the one thing, or there's 2 points actually, that I think we all agree on, is that the energy system needs to change from where it is today, but also it is indeed changing already. So this leads us very naturally to the topic of innovation. The tagline of ETP 2015 is Mobilizing Innovation to Accelerate Climate Action. And as Jean-Francois already alluded, this topic has never been more relevant than in today's rapidly changing technological arena, but also as we head to the Conference of Parties, or the COP21 meeting this year in Paris, where we hope to see agreement on how we're going to meet global climate goals. So what today, as we discuss the topic of innovation, we hope to demonstrate a grounded view of innovation, moving away in some respects from some of the hype around this topic and providing some encouraging but also indeed some challenging sector-specific examples on the progress that needs to happen in technology. We're going to cover the topics of renewables, carbon capture and storage, the heavy industrial sector, and touch upon emerging economies. As an introduction, myself and my colleague Christina Hood, we are going to discuss innovation itself and provide an introduction to the Energy Technologies publication. Before I get into the content, I do want to just touch on a few housekeeping items. We have over 500 registrations for the event today, so therefore we want to encourage a discussion through this, but we are going to have some trouble taking all the questions. And we're going to do this through written form. You'll see on your screen there's a questions tab. So we ask you to submit questions via this section, and we're going to try to get to as many as possible. Lastly, there is a second webinar that is being planned, and it will focus more specifically on the modeling results and the chapter on China. But for today, we're going to focus on the thematic portion, which is on innovation. So let me start into the technical topic, the topic of innovation. I don't at this point seem to have control of the slide deck, so I will just comment to my colleagues in Paris that when I say next slide, if you could advance this to me, or alternatively, if you do indeed transfer the control of this to me, I will endeavor to do that myself. So first off, as a way of introduction, I wanted to, I do want to go back to the first slide for this introduction. I want to say that technological advances and innovation are indeed embedded in the modeling work that underpins Energy Technology Perspectives, or ETP. In this modeling, we look at technology costs that decline with increasing deployment following anticipated experience curve. The modeling efforts, though, should indeed not be considered as forecasts, but rather as a way to look at where we need to go. We need to accept the uncertainty and take the insights from the analysis and use them to take action today. One of my favorite quotes is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I do indeed believe that the modeling work that we do at the IEA is very much useful. So with this understanding, ETP considers three scenarios. there's the 6-degree scenario, which is a continuation of current trends of where we're going today. And we believe that this is going to lead to disastrous results affecting climate change. There is the 4-degree scenario, as shown in some of this analysis here, and that reflects recent action, but as well announced actions that are coming, that are expected in the near term. And this shows that there is some benefit to these actions, but indeed not enough. And the core scenario is the 2-degree scenario. And this reflects the needed technology deployment to meet global climate goals. But recognizing that there's no single technology, we're going to look across a range of technologies to solve the energy decarbonization challenge. Now on this first slide, I want to reflect, this is entitled Global ESG Trends, and what ESG means is the Energy Sector Carbon Intensity Index. And when we look historically, looking first at the left-hand side with the global analysis, what we see is that historically, going back over the last 20 years, we see that the intensity of the energy sector has not really changed. And what's important to this is that, and what this doesn't show is that actually though energy demand has increased, so we are emitting more CO2 emissions from the energy sector. And when we look on a global side out to 2050, we see that if we continue with current trends, we're going to see no little change in the intensity, but we are going to see more emissions due to increased energy use. When we compare that to the 2-degree scenario, what we see is a dramatic change from where we are today, where the intensity of the energy sector is significantly reduced, and that is combined with a leveling off of our global energy demand so that emissions from the energy sector are very much reduced. But it is important to understand the global aspect, but we also need to look at it from a regional perspective. When we look at the OECD region, what we see is that there has been some progress in the past, but we have to see much more progress moving forward. But switching to the non-OECD region, we actually have seen their energy sectors become more carbon intensive as the countries develop, and we also see a very rapid increase in energy demand. So this really leads to the imperative of the importance of non-OECD regions having the tools, deploying the tools as they develop to reduce their intensity and hopefully moderate through energy efficiency their energy demand. Next slide, please. And what we see is that it's not one single technology that can make a difference. When we look across the entire energy sector, we see that energy efficiency is an incredibly important area and actually contributes the largest amount of global emissions to global emission reductions to 2050, but it alone cannot enable us to meet global climate goals in the most cost-effective fashion. What we see is we need a range of technologies, renewables, carbon capture and storage, end-use fuel switching, as well as nuclear energy playing a role. But one of the new pieces of analysis that we did this year is that we took a look at where these technologies are being deployed. And I found this to be a very interesting piece because when we look at renewables, for example, on the bottom figure, we see that they are primarily out to 2050 being deployed in the power sector. And we see that energy efficiency is very important, more so in the end-use sectors and less so in the power generation sector. So I think this is important as we look at the portfolio of technologies and understand what technologies we need to target in which specific sectors. Next slide, please. And the electricity is a sector where I think it shows a very good example of the scale of change that needs to happen. When we look at this figure on the left-hand side, we have the continuation of current trends through the 6-degree scenario, and we have on the right-hand side the 2-degree scenario. Two major aspects that we see is that we see a a lesser growth in the amount of electricity demand out to 2050. So we're using energy efficiency in the end-use sectors to reduce the net amount of electricity that we need by 2050. But a greater change, when we look at the share today of fossil fuels that contribute to electricity generation, it's at just under 70%. Out to 2050, if we continue on these trends, that amount stays about the same in our analysis. Even though the deployment of renewables grows, still the share of fossil fuels is close to 70%. We contrast that to the 2-degree scenario, and we see a complete share reversal, and we see that renewables reach almost 65% by 2050, and fossils are significantly reduced out of the electricity sector. So this here I wanted to show to indicate the scale of change that we see in the energy sector. But the one thing that I continue to emphasize is that the developed world today, the OECD, we need to definitely reduce our emissions, but really we contribute to around only 30% of cumulative emission reductions by 2050, and it's the non-OECD countries that contribute about 70% of cumulative emissions out in that time frame, and that really shows us where we need to focus our emphasis and make sure that the technologies that may be deployed already in the developed world or the new technologies that are being developed need to be applied globally and especially in those emerging economies. Next slide, please. So now I want to start moving into the topic, and we'll be soon shifting this over to Christina Hood. The focus on innovation this year, as I stated earlier, is very important because we need to look not only at the technology we have today, but also at the technology that we can see coming through the pipeline, the technology that can enable us to get there faster than we are going today. And it's important to understand how technology innovation works. The one point I want to make is that often it's looked at very much as a linear model. You start with research, you go through development, demonstration, deployment, you're done with the technology. But what the reality is that we see when we look at how innovation happens in real life is that there's a continued feedback. You may start with innovation and move on and go all the way through to deployment, but the lessons learned in the deployment stage can feed all the way back to inform new research, new improvements that can happen throughout the innovation chain. There is a constant feedback that's happening. And I think this is an important point that supports the subsidies and the other support mechanisms that happen throughout the innovation chain, supporting technologies in the deployment stage to accelerate them through that, because innovation will continue throughout that process. It is an ongoing development in the innovation chain. We cannot simply fund things through research and development and expect them to be magically deployed in real markets. We have, and a number of the speakers today will speak to that to highlight how that's happening, especially in the renewables field. And the other point that I want to make here is that it is not just the research labs that are going to do this work. This work has to happen and include a range of actors, including researchers, including private sector, including consumers and society, so that there is broad level support for this work. And it operates from a systems perspective. And I think this is a very important change in thinking and is needed to inform governments and private sector as they try to innovate, as they try to improve technology, how they can do this and accelerate this needed development. Next slide, please. And what we see when we look just at the first 3 stages of the innovation chain, the research and development and the demonstration, is that support is increasing for this. We are seeing more money being deployed. But the problem is that we are seeing this slip as a priority in IEA member countries. And we see that it's come from a point of about 11% back in the 1980s, but it's slipped to just over 3 or around 4% today. And so there really has been a decrease in emphasis on the energy sector. Now you might point out that two things. I'm looking only at RD&D here, and I'm also only looking at IEA member countries. Well, there's a reason for that. There is a lack of data that reaches into the deployment stage, and the reason for that is often due to the competitive nature of that in the private sector, who don't want to share the amount of money they're putting into the deployment or even the research level stage of innovation. And this is a problem because without the data, it's difficult to understand what steps are being taken or can be taken. But also, the data focuses only on IEA member countries, which is a subset of developed countries under the OECD. And again, this is due to a lack of data. And this is something that we are at the IEA working on in order to try to get more data to have better visibility. But if you can go to the next slide, please. We can look at this data a little differently, and we are seeing some positive signs. What this figure shows is that we're looking at how the funding trends throughout the different sectors and how they're being directed. And we are seeing that RD&D is more broadly directed towards the transition. We're seeing a significant increase in funding to renewable energy. We've seen in the fossil fuel space, it has grown in the last number of years, but it's largely being directed to fossil fuels and other efficiency measures. And we're seeing more funding in the energy efficiency area. So these, to us, are very positive developments, and we are very pleased to see this change that is supporting the transition to a much more sustainable energy system. Next slide, please. And the last slide that I want to speak to before I pass it over to Christina Hood is that what is very important is to define the right policy at the right time. So we've emphasized already the importance of innovation support throughout the innovation chain from research and development through deployment, but that doesn't mean it's the same type of support throughout. So we see that at the R&D stage, we see that grants and tax incentives and direct financial support can be very important to push those through the development stage. But as we move forward, we see that market creation becomes more important as technologies start to move closer together in terms of cost. You see more technology neutral and declining support needed, so that again you can allow the benefits to a market approach to take effect and begin pushing those technologies where they make most sense in different regions. And just lastly, we see that as the technologies really mature, you see market barriers that need to be addressed, and that's where performance standards or building codes or CO2 pricing can then begin to support those technologies on a much more level playing field and address those other barriers that earlier stages have not, and those types of mechanisms cannot address. So we need to adjust the funding and support type as the technologies mature, and this is very important because many support mechanisms do indeed get criticized because they are misguided and done in a way that doesn't consider these aspects. So now I want to pass this over to Christina Hood. Christina, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, David. Okay, thank you, David. So my name is Christina Hood. I'm with the Climate Change Unit here at the IEA, and I'm just to finish off this introductory part of the presentation, going to move the discussion from the general issues of innovation and climate to focus more specifically for a few minutes on innovation in the context of the United Nations climate negotiations. The picture that you see on the screen here is the negotiating session that was held in Bonn just over a week ago, where delegates are busily working on the text of what will hopefully be the new Paris Climate Agreement in just 80 more days, the Paris meeting starting. So as we look towards COP21, countries are considering greenhouse gas targets for 2025 and 2030 timeframes. As they think about what they can commit to, they're going to need to know what to expect from technological innovation over that timeframe. And they're also going to need to know what needs to be done to make this potential a reality. Because the fact is that if countries have greater confidence that innovation will deliver, there is the potential to set more ambitious emissions reduction goals based on the expected technology costs and performance in the future, not just constraining our thinking to what is available today. In addition to this initial round of target setting, over time, the way that the Paris framework is being set up is that there's an expectation that countries will be strengthening their targets regularly, perhaps every 5 years. So as we see successful innovation, reducing costs, increasing performance, this can increase the feasibility of action over time and the feasibility of stronger targets to be set on a regular basis. So in ETP 2015, we saw 4 main elements as being critical to helping build this greater confidence and innovation amongst climate policy decision makers. So not necessarily the energy policy people or the innovation, science and technology policy people, but now talking about what the climate targets are. So the first element is for those climate policymakers to have a better understanding of what constitutes high-quality innovation policy and support, and to know that that is in place in their jurisdiction and in others, so they can have greater confidence that the RD&D efforts that are underway have the best chance of success. David just talked about some of those aspects, so I'm not going to repeat that here. The second element is for there to be greater visibility that an adequate level of research, development, demonstration and deployment is taking place. So we expect that much of this actual RD&D activity is going to happen outside the UNFCCC process, but there are certainly things that UNFCCC can do to raise the visibility of these efforts to climate policy makers and also to provide a signal of their importance. So a few suggested approaches were discussed in ETP 2015. Firstly, through the transparency frameworks, which is the word we use for the kind of reporting, regular reporting of information. So this could be either, excuse me, either the biennial reports or national communications for those who know about the UNFCCC. There could be a collection of information on countries' RD&D activity. This could be compiled to give a regular snapshot on the adequacy of collective efforts on RD&D, and it could draw attention to shortfalls at the global aggregate level. This reporting would also, in a way, give recognition to those countries who are playing a leading role in supporting technology development. A second suggestion that we had was that, as I said, there's likely to be a process of continued regular strengthening of targets. And to inform these cycles of strengthening, a more detailed report could be produced, which would both compile the national actions but also assess progress globally in the costs and performance of key technologies against milestones. And this would be a useful tool when countries are considering what's feasible and what's likely to be feasible over a time frame of 10 years or so. And then finally, on this slide, I think we thought that the financial mechanisms in the UNFCCC could, including through the Green Climate Fund, could consider moving support to some of the earlier stages of technology innovation. There's already a strong focus on deployment of mature technologies, technology transfer, but there are also very large needs in the earlier stages of demonstration, RD&D, and particularly for developing and emerging economies to be able to participate in some of that activity. So together, these types of ideas would give greater visibility to the actions and also highlight where greater action is needed. The third element in giving confidence in innovation was to give policymakers a more concrete snapshot of what is actually in the technology pipeline, so what is coming between now and 2025 or 2030. So this information could be compiled as part of that same 5-yearly report that I mentioned that could inform countries as they set their national target. I wanted to give you 3 examples of the kinds of innovations that we might expect to see. So we could see faster deployment, which means better policies, cost reductions, and performance improvements. On the first, innovations can be expected in terms of policy. So this graph shows countries' fuel economy targets in the green, and you can see the Global Fuel Economy Initiative 2025 target, so it's the yellow line, is all actually already being met in some countries. So achieving this global goal is, for a large part, a matter of migrating best practice policies and not just a case of developing new technologies, although some of that will obviously also be needed. So innovation and diffusion of policy is one aspect. The next is perhaps much more familiar, the benefits of innovation and cost reductions. This is probably a graph that many of you have seen before. It's the cost reductions in solar photovoltaic modules over time. And again, expectations for continued improvements into the coming decades, and that's something that climate policymakers should definitely be factoring into their thinking. And then lastly are the benefits of innovation in terms of performance improvement, where technologies simply become practical in new situations where they weren't before. So this is a graph of the performance of wind at different wind speeds along the x-axis, and it shows essentially the percentage of time that they would operate on the y-axis, and then it shows different lines for the technology maturing over time, so that you can see that as technologies have matured starting in 2002, moving up to today, the technology becomes practical at lower wind speeds, and it allows greater usage of the technology. So it's not just a matter of cost or policy; the actual performance can improve as well. The fourth and final element that we see in this suite building confidence is for vibrant multilateral technology collaborations to be in place, so that those climate policymakers can see both that action is happening and more specifically that there are options for them to join as they want to achieve their own national objectives. What you see on the screen here in very, very small type, I'm sorry, is a collection of the multilateral collaborations that the IEA surveyed, I think, last year, and now standing at around 28, and this is only multilateral, not bilateral or individual country innovation programs. So this is a small minority, in fact, of the total set of innovation programs underway. But you'll see that activity has really been blossoming since around 2005. Many of these programs build on long-standing collaborations, including the IEA's own energy technology initiative. But in recent years, there's been an interesting trend toward greater participation of major emerging economies in these programs, which makes a lot of sense because they're going to be the drivers of both the development and use of many of these new technologies in the coming decades. And the vehicle for this has sometimes been the inclusion of sustainable energy programs through existing multilateral initiatives, including the G20 and APEC. So just to summarize our thinking, while the UNFCCC can provide strong signals of the need for technology development, it can track the levels, it can use that information to help inform countries as they set their climate goals. Our expectation really is a lot of the action is going to happen beyond the UNFCCC, including through multilateral partnerships like these. And I'm now going to hand back to David to conclude this introduction section.
Thank you, Christina. And as we move to the last slide in this section, we're coming back to the point that Christina made earlier, which is that we need to be tracking what we're doing. I would say the ETP analysis looks forward to 2050 and says this is where we want to go now. How are we doing today? And this is the tracking mechanism here. We look at technology penetration, we look at market creation, and we look at technology development, because all of those things play an important role in how we would judge a technology and where it is today. And what's clear, unfortunately, is that clean energy deployment and its development is not ramping up fast enough. And when we look at this figure and compare it to the last 2 years when we have done a similar type of analysis, right now we're seeing that none of the technologies are moving fast enough. The red, this is like a stoplight essentially, with a green, yellow, and red, and essentially we have no green technologies that are moving fast enough, whereas 2 years ago we had 2 technologies in that area. Last year we had 1 technology moving fast enough, but actually this year we have concerns across all technologies. But what is interesting is that we did want to look at short-term trends as well, and that's the small arrow on the left-hand side. And what we see is that across a number of technologies, although we don't believe they are at the stage they should be to meet long-term climate goals, we are seeing encouraging signs. And in one of the presentations here today, you'll hear much more about carbon capture and storage, but that is one of the areas where we had a significant milestone with a large demonstration project being started in Canada in 2015, or sorry, I think it was late 2014, that has really pushed that technology forward. And so we are concerned that technology is not ramping up fast enough in its technology penetration and market creation, nor in technology development, but we are seeing some encouraging trends, and we do indeed want to emphasize that. More work is needed. Let's build upon the work that has been already done. So that concludes this introduction, and we have received a number of different questions, and I want to pass the one question back to Christina before we move on to the next step. And the question that came through is regarding multilateral initiatives, how do we avoid overlapping among them? Coordination appears to be a significant challenge. Would you be able to comment on that, Christina?
Sure, thanks, David. Now, of course, when you have, the bottom-up blossoming of, many, many initiatives, there is a big question mark around duplication of effort. And, there are different perspectives you can take. One would be, well, we could try to come up with a coordinated global system where there is an agreed grand plan of what everyone is going to separately do. Or you can work from the bottom up, and each initiative to coordinate with the others and look for where the gaps are in the existing efforts. And with the initiatives that I've been involved in, that has certainly been the approach, is that it's not like people are launching initiatives for the sake of it. It's because they see a gap in implementation is what is already going on, and then they seek to work actively with the other organisations that are in the same space to make sure there isn't duplication of effort. And that's certainly one of the the key recommendations from the IEA in terms of RD&D and deployment activities is to really work to try and avoid that sort of duplication.
Great, thank you for that, and I would agree very much that that is the case. We definitely are encouraged, let's say, in the energy community to see the number of initiatives increase, but that is definitely a concern, and I think you've got it right. I see that as well too in the organizations I'm involved in, trying to solve the gaps, but there is always an appreciation with limited resources across, I'd say, the business sector and government sectors, that we need to coordinate and make sure that we're getting our biggest value for the resources we deploy, and that's both financial and personnel. So thank you for that question from the audience, and thank you, Christina, for that answer. Well, I'd like to move on to getting into depth of one of the specific topics this year, so if you can change the presentation. We're going to hear from the chapter on mainstreaming variable renewables in power markets, and we're going to hear from Simon Mueller, our expert on this topic from the IEA. And I think this is a very interesting topic because it talks about one of those areas where we're seeing that the technology has matured very significantly, and now the challenge is changing. It's evolving to a much more market-based and integration aspect. So I always enjoy hearing Simon speak, so I want to turn this over to Simon Mueller. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. While we're getting the IT infrastructure set up here, I'll quickly introduce myself. As David has said, my name is Simon Mueller. I work in the Renewable Energy Division here at the IEA, where I focus on the grid integration and market integration of wind and solar power. And this is also very much the focus of the talk that I will be giving now in the following minutes. It will be about mainstreaming variable renewables in power markets. Main points that I'd like to convey in the following are, first of all, that we will be seeing a step change in the kind of policy, regulatory, and market frameworks needed to actually achieve the 2DS. And I will look into what will be needed to achieve this. On the one hand, to kickstart new markets where we are not seeing deployments yet, to managing the cost of scaling up deployment in countries, and then finally, what performance characteristics an integrated framework needs to deliver to make wind and solar one of the key pillars on the way to decarbonization of the power sector more broadly. Before I go into these considerations, I'd like to share with you some fresh data that we've collected at the Renewable Energy Division here at the IEA that summarize some of the most recent remuneration contract prices for wind and solar power, and also solar thermal electricity. The main point of this slide is to underline that we're really entering a new phase of deployment where we're seeing increasingly examples of costs that are comparable to new build alternatives. Now, certainly, this is levelized costs of electricity. We need to factor in the wider system effects to have really a comparable basis. But nevertheless, I would say it is interesting news and it is good news that we are seeing, for example, solar PV utility projects in the MENA region at prices right now that we've seen in Dubai most recently at $60 per megawatt hour, or in a country that is quite close to there in Egypt, we've seen a wind tender closing at just above $40 per megawatt hour. So clearly this is an encouraging trend where we're seeing prices drop, but as David has shown on his concluding slide in the previous presentation, even this is far from enough to get us onto a trajectory that is compatible with the 2DS. Now, this is what such a trajectory would look like. On this slide, you see the generation in terms of terawatt hours that we would need globally to be on track with the 2DS scenario. You see the deployment that we currently have today in the little bars up to 2013, that's the data bases where we have observed deployment, is very, very small. compared to the level of deployment where we need to get to. And this really calls for a new phase of wind and solar deployment. We've made a very rough generalization in categorizing deployment phases into three. The first phase, where we've had technology support mainly focused on R&D small deployment programs that didn't really reach scale. We then had a phase where, in particular, OECD countries led to a rapid buildup of wind and solar power, driven primarily through supportive policies that had the aim of covering a very large cost gap vis-a-vis fossil alternatives. And then something that I will be speaking about in the final half of my talk, we see a need for a more integrated framework where we do not consider wind and solar power in isolation anymore, but we take a systems view of the electricity and wider energy system and ask the question really, how do we need to change the market rules? What elements of support policies might still be needed? What would they look like? What kind of regulation needs to be in place to really have a consistent approach to maintaining the momentum of deployment for these technologies? Now, certainly to reach the deployment figures that you see here, one crucial step that needs to be achieved is that deployment needs to spread into a large number of new markets. And this is the first consideration where I want to go a bit more in depth. What does it mean when you want to begin deployment of wind and solar PV in a country where this hasn't taken place yet? We see the need for for clearing barriers in 5 main areas. And this really still holds at a time where we say wind and solar PV are getting increasingly competitive. It's really about laying the ground, about having the enabling framework to make economically sound use of these technologies. First criterion is the availability of locally adapted technology and human resources. For example, as we move from colder climate countries of PV deployment into more sunny countries, the adaptation of the technology is quite important. Also, for example, having wind turbine technology that can withstand extreme temperatures and so forth. Then the whole question of permitting. Do we have streamlined permitting procedures? Actually, is there in the spatial planning foreseen to have something like a wind park somewhere? What are the requirements for environmental impact assessment and so forth? Third point, something that should not be underestimated, is obtaining the authorization for grid connection. And this includes system operators assessing the feasibility of integrating wind and solar power. More often than not, if we have a market where wind and PV are just entering, we see overly cautious concerns of system operators that can really block progress altogether if there is overly restrictive rules in terms of how much capacity can be connected to the grid by when. The fourth point, quite crucial, and actually I would say this is really the true reason of success in terms of stimulating deployment that we've seen in a number of feed-in tariff systems, which is the off-taker agreement. So at which price can what quantity of electricity be sold? And here, as I'll elaborate more later on in my presentation, the certainty of the revenue stream is crucial since wind and solar PV are extremely capital-intensive technologies. And that brings me to the last point on financing. Of course, all of this is good and nice, but if you're not able to raise the capital that is necessary to develop, plan, and build these projects, nothing is going to happen. Now, when governments consider how to go about setting up a framework like this, of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, but these individual project needs that I've just spoken about have to be seen in the context of the market structure and the system structure in which you want to add wind and solar PV. Here we have one very broad categorization in what we call dynamic and stable electricity systems. A dynamic system is characterized by a need for investment anyway, be it to meet incremental demand or be it to meet the retirement of larger amounts of generation capacity. In a situation like this, you need new additions anyway, and then of course it is easier to add new generation in an economically sound way. It's much more difficult if a system is already well served and you, in the end, induce a situation of overcapacity. The second point that I've noted on the slide is the idea of liberalized versus regulated markets. So it's very different if we're looking at a market that has a liberalized wholesale power market with generators competing to produce electricity, or if we're looking at a system where we still have a vertically integrated utility as a monopoly supplier. I'll give you one example going back a little bit more into history, just because I think it's worthwhile to, let's say, reinvestigate some of the myths that we see about countries where feed-in tariffs have been used to stimulate deployment, in particular of solar PV. I've taken the example of Germany here, and the main point I want to make here is when we look at the early days of solar PV deployment, it was not only about having very high remuneration to begin with, but it was also about streamlining the permitting procedures, guaranteeing timely grid connection, then having the certainty of the remuneration that it was granted for 20 years, and also to have system operators mandated to balance forecast errors. And the financing situation was also enhanced for solar PV projects. So what we see here, it was a comprehensive approach to kickstart the market. Of course, some of this can be very different when you want to kickstart a market at today's solar PV costs. So for example, a capital grant of this level would seem unnecessary, in particular because the technology is very proven and deployed at scale today. But nevertheless, the main message remains, it's about having a comprehensive package to kickstart the market. Now let's go from this very initial phase to the phase where we see deployment picking up, when we're going from maybe megawatts or dozens of megawatts to gigawatts. What you see here is, maybe it looks a little bit busy in the beginning, it's a comparison of the cost of solar PV. You see that in the blue area, and then the remuneration that was provided in the darker blue line for utility scale solar PV in Germany. And what we see is that actually Germany has been quite successful at tracking the cost evolution, at making sure that remuneration levels did not persistently stay above actual costs. Now, of course, we also have an element of value-based pricing so that the costs are also driven by remuneration. But nevertheless, Germany was actually, contrary to common belief, quite successful in guiding down the remuneration per kilowatt hour. However, what didn't work well is to guide the deployment volumes under this system, in particular during the years of 2010 to 2012, as you can see in the graph. Since then, the lesson has been learned for solar PV that it's quite important to not only control the per kilowatt hour remuneration or megawatt hour remuneration, but also the deployment volumes. Something that is less spoken about and that I wanted to share with you today as well is, it's not just about looking at one technology across the board, but it's also important to see the differences between different sub-technologies. What you see here is the same information as presented previously for utility scale PV in Germany, just that these graphs are now showing residential and commercial PV in Italy. We see two important differences. One important difference, Italy has been less successful at tracking the cost of solar PV, undershooting remuneration in the beginning and overshooting considerably, in particular in the commercial sector. And if we look at the annual capacity additions that you see in the bars, what you can observe is that the commercial sector has been responsive much more quickly than the residential sector. So we see that the right type of policy isn't only about the deployment phase or country context, but could be very much also about tailoring it to the particular sub-technology in question. And what we see here, that's a pattern that we also see in other markets, is that in the residential sector, the uptake is generally more smoothly, and we don't have such great problems with very, very quick deployment spikes. There's one final slide that I want to present to you about how to adjust policies in this phase where we can still consider wind and PV as new additions to the system where they're scaling up rapidly. And this is reaping the benefit of competition. What we see here are examples from Brazil and Italy. The graphs again follow a similar logic with showing you the remuneration against cost. And what is striking here is how much remuneration was reduced through the introduction of an auction. I think really the most salient example is the situation in Brazil, where we see the introduction of an auction in 2010, and we see deployment at very, very competitive prices going ahead. Similar results can be observed in Italy. So let me sum up what I've spoken about so far. This is very much how can we go about kickstarting and scaling up deployment in new markets, learning the policy lessons that we've already observed in the past. And now I want to turn to the final part of this presentation, which is looking at more integrated policy, market, and regulatory frameworks. As the share of wind and solar PV rises on the power system, it's no longer appropriate to see them as an isolated component of the system, but it's much more appropriate to rethink the system as a whole and see how the different assets can actually work together well in a cost-effective and secure way. And what we find is it's quite striking that wind and solar PV share some of the properties or share properties of other low-carbon technologies. Most importantly, the cost structure of low-carbon technologies is characterized by a high degree of capital intensity. What you see on this figure is a comparison between the average cost of electricity measured in LCOE in 2050 in Europe, in the 2DS scenario, compared to the short-run marginal cost of the very same technologies. And what you can see is that for most technologies, there is a huge difference between their average cost and their marginal cost, so what it costs to produce electricity once the asset has already been built. And this big difference has very important implications for the design of integrated frameworks that actually achieve to stimulate deployment at a rate commensurate with the 2DS. This is very closely linked to the current form of market design. So the considerations that I'll be making in the following are very much appropriate for those countries that do have liberalized wholesale spot markets. I'm also happy to speak about systems where these markets are not in place, but we still have a cost-based regulation in place. The considerations there are different, but nevertheless, this here is very important for a large number, in particular, of OECD countries. What you see here, and you might be very familiar with, is the price formation on wholesale electricity markets in one given hour. You see a different set of technologies arranged by increasing short-run costs. So I'm speaking about the costs that were shown on the lower half of the figure just before. What we see is the violet, almost vertical bar is the demand for electricity at this very given point in time. And we see that it intersects with the 1 unit of natural gas combined cycle generation. So at this point, the price would be set at the marginal cost of a CCGT, which is approximately $60 per megawatt hour in the example. Now you see that the short-run cost of wind and solar, nuclear and coal in this example is much lower than this price. And it is precisely through this additional revenue that the fixed capital costs can be recovered. So in order to recoup the investment of wind and solar PV, these hours when costs rise above, when market prices rise above marginal cost of wind and solar PV are critical. As we now look at the transition towards the 2DS, what risks are actually there that challenge cost recovery? And I will go through them one by one. The first situation that we see in a number of European markets is a situation of overcapacity. So what has just happened is I've stretched the amount of coal capacity in the system. This has pushed the supply curve to the right, and immediately the market price has dropped. So we're now considering a different system, a system with a lot of legacy coal capacity, as is typical for a large number, or for some countries where there's a large number of old coal capacity. And we see very low market prices that generate a generally bad climate for investment. So the first impediment to actually having investment in wind and solar PV can be transitional overcapacity. And this can, depending on the rate at which we add wind and solar PV, such overcapacity can actually persist quite some time. Now back to the original graph, and we look at the next risk that can challenge cost recovery for these technologies. To make a simple illustration, I've just assumed that both fossil fuel and CO2 prices are lower than expected in the next figure. And again, what we see is that market prices are depressed. The additional revenue that wind and solar PV can generate on markets above and beyond their short-run costs is reduced. And therefore, once again, cost recovery is challenged. So this is the next risk factor that can actually inhibit deployment, which is the risk of low fossil fuel and potentially low CO2 prices. Now, there is another effect that is linked to power system flexibility. It's also sometimes known as the self-cannibalization effect of wind and solar PV, implying that if there's a lot of wind in the system, all wind generators are generating, and therefore market prices will be very low. In fact, the story is somewhat more complicated than that. The degree to which market prices will be very low at times of high infeed of wind and solar PV depends on system flexibility. And what I'm showing you on this slide is an economic representation of this flexibility. This is the demand and supply curve on the EPEX spot market for 1 hour. And we see the sharp inflection points both on the upper end of supply, the lower end of supply, the upper end of demand and the lower end of demand, indicating the inflexibility of the system. That, for example, supply must not fall below 35 gigawatts in this system, otherwise generators are willing to accept extremely negative market prices in order to keep operating. The same is that demand above 41 gigawatts will only be possible at extremely negative prices. Now, what does increased flexibility do to this system? As we increase the flexibility of demand, we actually avoid going to very extreme prices on the one end, and by adjusting the supply curve with less baseload generation, more peaking generation, having imports, we smooth out this part of the curve. Similarly, through reduction of must-run capacities, providing system services from renewable energies, we can reduce the amount of must-run capacity. And finally, through coupling with other sectors such as power to heat and e-mobility, we can get rid of the inflexibility on the demand side. So all of this, what you're seeing here is, let's say, a very abstract and economic representation of smart grids, of more flexible power plants, of more system-friendly variable renewables, all these elements that contribute to making the power system more flexible. The good news is we have a number of options to achieve that and to stabilize market prices. The bad news is they won't happen by themselves, and if there is the risk that they will not happen, this will be priced into the cost of capital for investors. Now, why should we care about that? Why do all of these risk factors that I've just explained to you matter so much? The problem is that the higher the risk, the higher will be the weighted average cost of capital. That's the abbreviation of the horizontal axis that you're seeing. This is just the cost of a hypothetical PV installation depending on different levels of capital cost, of the cost of capital. And what you see is that as the cost of capital increases up to 20%, which is a very high number, the share of financing in the overall cost of the PV system grows larger and larger. At a weighted average cost of capital of 9%, we already see that half of the costs are financing costs. So all of the risks that I've just spoken about, the risk of transitional overcapacity and depressed prices, the risk of low fossil fuel and CO2 prices, the risk of low power system flexibility, all of these will translate into higher risk premiums and ultimately higher costs for deployment and overall more sluggish deployment trajectory. This slide sums this up once again. So if we look at what do we need in terms of an integrated policy, market, and regulatory framework, it has to perform on these 5 key challenges. We have to unlock investments in capital-intensive technologies. We have to overcome the existing lock-in of carbon-intensive generation, for example, by reducing the amount of overcapacity in systems. We have to effectively price externalities, otherwise we have the problem that I illustrated with the low CO2 prices. And we have to secure sufficient investments in flexible resources so that we can actually maintain, let's say, healthy prices on power markets even at high levels of variable generation. There's one point that we're currently working on and that I'll be happy to share with you about 1 year from now when we conclude analysis on this, which is ensuring also operational efficiency at large shares of variable and distributed generation. So how we actually operate a power system when we literally have millions of individual generators. So to sum up, what does this mean for electricity market design? We could contrast 2 extremes. One is an energy-only market plus a CO2 mechanism, where cost recovery is ensured exactly the way that I illustrated previously. We could have, on the other extreme, regulated assets, for example, those that are happening under a feed-in tariff or contracts for difference. Or we could try to have a hybrid system where we complement an energy-only market with a CO2 mechanism and a mechanism to mitigate long-term risk. One example of such a risk mitigation mechanism comes in the form of market premium models. So you see here the revenue in green that a generator would be making on the electricity market, and then missing revenue can be topped up via such a contract. That would be the orange part, and revenues that exceed the requirements of the generator could then be returned. That's what you see in blue. Another approach could be to give a fixed energy premium, so a markup on top of the electricity price. Both of these systems have different advantages and disadvantages. I'm happy to speak about that in the Q&A if you're interested in this. But for now, I'll keep it at this and conclude. So to wrap up, wind and solar PV will require an integrated market policy and regulatory framework to achieve the 2-degree scenario. These frameworks need to match the country context as well as technology and market maturity, and they need to deliver on the 5 key challenges that I've shown you previously. In summary, the role of policies is shifting away from covering a large cost gap vis-a-vis alternative technologies towards risk mitigation for capital-intensive technologies and supporting enabling technologies. And ultimately, an integrated framework for reaching the 2DS may require a degree of convergence across liberalized and regulated markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Enjoyed that very much. We have time for one question, and I think it touches to your last content slide before the conclusion that you were starting to get into this. And the question speaks, if I understand correctly, the point has been made that liberalized markets are important for kickstarting renewable energy markets to respond, but it has also been mentioned that the importance of secure purchase of the power. Could the speaker please talk on the potential conflict between these 2 concepts? Could you respond to that, Simon?
I'm very happy to. I think this touches upon the very heart of a large political debate that's currently going on, where actually the IA will be publishing a larger publication in a few months from now that looks precisely at the question of electricity market design for decarbonization. Let me first say that power market liberalization has a number of advantages to introduce innovative technologies and has been extremely useful to provide grid access to new technologies such as wind and solar PV. At the same time, the persistent challenge of liberalized wholesale power markets has always been to provide sufficient revenues at a high degree of certainty to recover investment costs. Now, it is possible in principle to do this on a purely market basis. However, the expected returns that you would need to pay for the associated risk premiums are quite high. which would translate into a requirement of very, very high CO2 prices. So rather than being fundamentally impossible to do this on a liberalized electricity market, I think the uncertainties and risks associated with the transition are so big that we need additional mechanisms to provide certainty to investors. However, when going about putting in place such mechanisms, we have to see that, first of all, they're cost effective, and that we don't lock out innovation, that we maintain the door open for those technologies that might deviate from the plan that governments have put in place at some point. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Well, I think if it did not, we are going to circle back and have a broader question area at the end of the webinar. So if it did not answer the question or has brought other questions, then please queue them up. We're keeping note of them here. And one just actually came in. It says, innovation plays a greater role on policy instruments and financing mechanisms than on technology advancement. And I think that's a perfect segue actually to the next presentation by our colleague Simon Bennett on CCS, carbon capture and storage, building on early opportunities. And I'm looking forward to hear Simon speak. He was very helpful also on the articulation of the innovation theme in addition to writing or leading this chapter on CCS. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Simon, and I hope that helps to answer that question or comment on what's more important. Does innovation play a greater role on policy instruments and financing, or does it play a greater role on technology advancement? And I leave it to you, Simon, to touch on this.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, and good afternoon to everybody out there listening to this webinar. Well, we'll see if that's something that we can get a grip on in the presentation I'm about to give. I'm probably going to conclude that it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's, I think, the nature of these things. Okay, as David said, we're shifting to one of the other key technologies in the 2DS scenario. For those of you that are not familiar with CCS, I think it's useful to remind everybody that it's the separation of carbon dioxide from mixtures of gases, and these are often the off gases from combustion of fossil fuels before they are released to the air, and the permanent storage of that CO2 to avoid overall increases in atmospheric CO2 due to the use of fossil fuels or the production of cement in our economies. Now, in the 2DS, carbon capture and storage finds application in a range of different sectors, and it from processes and range of sectors where processes and places where the alternatives are likely to actually end up much more costly. Steel production, cement manufacture, the processing of oil and gas, and dispatchable power generation from fossil fuels all fall into this category. But we actually noticed that the real impact of CCS is not seen immediately in the 2DS, because it's building out from a low base, and crucially it's dependent on emissions cutting policies that do not yet exist in a stringent enough form in pretty much any country that we can see. So we need to look at what is a smooth pathway to improve CCS technology and its accompanying political and regulatory environment, so that it's actually available when it is needed to do some of the heavy lifting for emissions reduction. And that's the perspective I'll be taking now. It's really an innovation story that we'll be telling, and we'll show how governments and firms can work together to keep CCS as an attractive tool for keeping total mitigation costs low, rather than discovering that when CCS is urgently needed for the decarbonization of certain key sectors, it remains painfully expensive due to a lack of attention during this decade and in the early years. Sadly, there's not enough time to go into all the details in the book, but I'll be pointing out certain places where there is more detail available in the book, and I hope that whets your appetite to get a hold of a copy and find out more. So we'll be covering 6 points in this section of the webinar. We'll start with a quick recap of the role of CCS, and then move on to an outline of the challenges that the 2DS lays out for it. Both large-scale experience with the technologies and research and development will play a role in overcoming these challenges from a technology perspective, and the pathways through which they can reinforce one another will be discussed. In the ETP book chapter, we've looked at both CO2 capture and CO2 storage in some detail, but I'll present only our findings for capture today, especially for the power sector due to time limitations. Then, in order to conclude this section of the webinar, I'll present the key findings and the opportunities for policy action that we highlighted as being of particular importance. And starting from the top, we'll start with why CCS is a critical technology. And I think it's possible to summarize the main reasons in 3 bullet points. There are other reasons that you might be able to think of, but this is my high-level list. And the first reason is cost and feasibility. And here I've borrowed from the 2014 IPCC report. And most energy system models that were reviewed by the IPCC cannot actually meet the emissions targets without including CCS in the portfolio of technologies. And among those that can meet the emissions trajectory, the median increase in mitigation costs due to the absence of CCS is actually 138%. And when we performed a similar exercise at the IA a few years ago, we found that total mitigation costs increased by 40% when CCS was unavailable to the electricity sector alone. And as I said, CCS is much more than just a technology for the electricity sector. So this cost increase shows that as the easier mitigation efforts are used up, CCS becomes more and more valuable. Now, it's not an understatement to say that or not an overstatement to say that the pace of the mitigation effort to meet the 2 degrees pathway is relatively overwhelming when you consider our dependency on carbon polluting industries today. But overall, the costs of adding CCS are massively outweighed by the costs that we would incur if we tried to replace all carbon-intensive processes with clean alternatives via other methods. For example, an industrial sector that applies CCS can provide the headroom to avoid expensive emissions reductions in, say, the aviation sector. Now, the main reasons why CCS is so valuable is that it's the only means to dramatically reduce emissions intensity from many industrial processes, and it's also the only real means to enable negative emissions, which could be required by mid-century. Now, when we talk about negative emissions, the best technology that we know of today is to extract CO2 from the air, either directly or using biomass growth, and then to either compress that CO2 or extract it from the biomass by combusting the biomass and using it for energy, and then storing it underground out of harm's way, and that is a form of CCS. And the third bullet I've highlighted relies on some fairly simple thinking about the risks of excluding options from the portfolio. CO2 emissions from natural gas use have increased by nearly 1/3 in the last decade. Coal has been the fastest growing source of energy for the past 5 years in absolute terms, and it is, in our opinion, risky to rely on strategies that depend on the complete elimination of fossil fuels. So, having set out the value of CCS to a world that commits to a CO2 emissions budget in line with the 2DS trajectory, we now move on to the challenge that CCS presents to the technology and the markets for CCS. If you like, we're moving from the systems planner perspective to the innovator's perspective. And we see that the ability of companies and governments to overcome non-technical challenges in the near future will determine the availability of CCS, and potentially thus determine our ability to meet the climate challenge in more general terms. So what I used in order to illustrate some of these challenges is the example of the world's cleanest coal-fired power plant. Now, Boundary Dam Unit 3, as David mentioned earlier, began its new life as a CCS plant in 2014. And it now emits around 10% of the CO2 per megawatt hour that it did before it was refurbished, and its performance since then has been as good, if not better, than anticipated. And if we move clockwise from the top left, we'll go through some of these challenges that it faced. And the first one is that CCS, frankly, is an expensive technology today for the power sector. And the addition of CCS for this first-of-a-kind plant cost around $8,000 per kilowatt. The second challenge is that projects often have long lead times. Boundary Dam took 3 or 4 years to complete after the final investment decision, but have been in a planning stage for much longer. For projects looking to store CO2 in saline formations, in formations that have not been extensively explored for oil and gas already, the lead times for developing a storage site can actually be up to a decade. Now, the third point is that most of the CO2 captured at Boundary Dam is today sold for use in enhanced oil recovery. And being able to sell that CO2 dramatically improves the project economics. But the EOR opportunity is not global. that is not currently available to European projects, for instance, and it's also reliant on the oil price for supporting production from the oil field that it's being used at. EOR also does not generate the necessary experience with other types of CO2 storage, such as saline formations, and it's noted that the link with the oil industry is often controversial with environmentalists. The fourth point notes that, as we expect, there is good news about the chances to reduce the costs of subsequent projects at Boundary Dam, but because of the size and cost of each CCS facility, the investment cycle is quite lumpy. Currently, we are seeing $1 or $2 billion projects into that kind of range come online each year, but that does not enable equipment suppliers globally to develop the economies of scale and the effective competition that is needed. Now, the final two challenges relate to the need to manage complexity. At Boundary Dam, SaskPower has managed to, has had to manage multiple funding parties and also a complex supply chain that's involved contractors that have not worked together before. And it's fair to say that the interface between the worlds of industrial production on the one hand and storage operations that are more like oil and gas processes on the other is an interface that is common to all CCS projects and presents challenges for contracting between parties. But it shouldn't be omitted that Boundary Dam clearly shows that these challenges are not insurmountable. At Boundary Dam, the combination of locally available, low-cost brown coal, the opportunity to sell carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery, and an emissions performance standard for new coal plants in Canada enabled a commercial investment decision to be taken. And that has been to the benefit of CCS development globally. So having outlined those challenges, I think we can look at some of the results from the 2DS scenario through the lens of those challenges. And what I've shown here is the growth in the amount of CO2 that is stored in the 2DS globally on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the potential of electricity generation that is covered by CCS-equipped plants. And it's clear that in order to get from where we are today to those deployment levels in the model, we must have made certain assumptions about CCS, as we do for all different technologies. So we can use that as the background for our discussion. In the 2DS, CCS deployment takes off in both the power and industrial sectors in the middle of the next decade, and by 2050 the shares of carbon dioxide abated through CCS in industrial and electricity applications are actually about equal, reinforcing the point I made earlier about this not being a technology just for the power sector. The deployment is higher in non-OECD countries as they see the build-out of more new manufacturing capacity and fossil fuel power plants over that the period covered by the 2DS. Now, the share of electricity generation from CCS plants rises in all regions, and it should be pointed out this is not just coal-fired generation but also gas-fired plants, which need to bring their emissions down below current levels in order to compete in a 2DS world. So we're assuming in our model that some of these challenges that were faced by Boundary Dam are actually overcome, that costs are assumed to come down, and the economic and political climate for CCS is assumed to improve. And these are not at all unreasonable assumptions for a world that commits today to meeting the 2 degrees target. And the result of that, the assumptions that we make about performance improvements are shown in this slide. Cost reductions for CCS, coupled with a carbon price penalty on unabated fossil fuel plants, bring CCS-equipped plants into competitiveness with other dispatchable forms of electricity generation by 2030. Just for clarification, in this chart, LWR is a nuclear light water reactor, CSP is concentrating solar power, CCGT is a combined cycle gas turbine, and USC-PC is an ultra-supercritical pulverized coal plant. So in the chart, you can also note that I've split out the cost premiums that you would need to pay to get a low emissions plant with CCS instead of the high emissions alternative. The cost premiums in light green relate to capital cost premiums, and in light purple, those are the additional fuel costs that are needed due to the the efficiency penalty of CCS. And in our assumptions, there are improvements to both the capital cost of CCS and the efficiency penalty. The capital costs actually are probably more significant overall. So having set out what those, some of the background to those assumptions is, we're going to look in the next section at how those assumptions might be realized in practice. And this is a discussion about different technology pathways. And there's 2 key points to convey when we're talking about the need for innovation to improve CCS. The first is that CCS is composed of three main components: the capture, the transport, and the storage of CO2. And these are very different aspects of the technology. They're each developing along different innovation paths, and they can be treated quite independently as component technologies. Investment into R&D and larger projects for CO2 capture can proceed independently from innovation in CO2 transport and storage, but the three elements must come together as a package that can be integrated with relatively low risk within the next decade. The second point is that after a decade of government efforts to support CCS projects, there are still only a very few countries that are any closer to the type and the stringency of climate policies that could underpin investments in CCS projects by ensuring a sustainable source of revenue for clean production. So, in the absence of such measures, the cost of adding CO2 to an industrial facility and operating it will inevitably make the facility less profitable and often borne by the public sector. And we noted that the willingness of governments and private companies to invest in CCS when actually the time and the price at which it will become commercially attractive are still unknown, has resulted in just a couple of billions of dollars per year globally going into the technology. And if this money is not dramatically increased, and there is no real sign of major changes that we know of above this rate, then achieving the needed cost reductions will require that the money is spent very wisely, in fact. So, as I highlighted for Boundary Dam, there are clear opportunities in certain sectors and countries where supportive factors can reduce the cost to the public purse and lead to projects with sustainable revenues. And in this book, we have called those opportunities sweet spots. And that term is sort of broadly analogous to the concept of niche markets in the broader innovation literature. But we've used it here to refer to situations in which projects can go ahead because these factors align in a way that allows money to flow lower than what would be required if all of that risk and cost fell directly on the public purse. To illustrate the first of these points, we've placed a non-exhaustive list of different technologies for CO2 capture, transport, and storage along a curve that shows maturity against capital requirements, a function of capital requirements and technology risk. And this shows that in the early stages of development, the capital requirements and risks to move the technology to the next stage are actually lower than at the stages where you're at the pilot and the early commercial phase. Now, the CO2 transport options that are in this chart are relatively more advanced than CO2 capture and storage. And that's worth noting, that there are differences in the three sections. And for the CO2 capture options, the key message here is that different technologies can actually be at different stages of development in different sectors, depending on the type of flue gas that you're dealing with. In fact, I would go as far as to say that they can be at different stages in different countries, depending on the specific conditions that would relate to commercial deployment in those countries. For the power sector, you can see from this chart that we're actually sitting at the most costly and the most risky point in the curve. The early commercial plants that are represented by Boundary Dam, have costs that reflect their first-of-a-kind nature, and they have financial risks that reflect the fact that their revenues rely on support schemes often that are not widely tested. A further aspect of this diagram is that it shows that we actually have a sequence of improved technologies climbing the slope that are aiming to displace those that are further along. There is actually competition coming up from newer technologies, and so we have the sort of the march towards commerciality of a range of different options. So I'd like us to look at this and conceptually think of the lab, the bench, and the pilot stages as being part of a research component, and the commercial stages as being part of a deployment component that are closely linked. And that's what I'd like to illustrate with the next slide. If I can. With problem moving ahead. There we go. Okay, and here I've illustrated the relationship between these two aspects by interlinking two virtuous circles. And these are centrally linked by the expansion of new commercial opportunities for the technologies. The new commercial opportunities increase commercial experience, and thus they lead to improvements through what we call learning by doing. And this is the deployment phase where experience leads to new innovations as practitioners gain experience in operating and find new ways in which to make improvements. Today, however, I would say that cost and performance improvements are largely driven by R&D investments over on the right-hand side, and these are often from the public sector. But we know from historical experience that learning by doing is often the powerful driver that needs to be engaged to bring down costs, especially bringing down capital costs of known technologies. And so that's why in the situation in which sweet spots that projects are deployed in increase, these two circles become more balanced, and they actually become more linked. There's an arrow been added between the new commercial opportunities and the R&D investment, and they're more self-reinforcing. And this is also an opportunity to lead to a rebalancing of the investment sources from public investment to private investment. And if you take any energy technology, I think from solar to hydraulic fracturing or turbines, you'll be able to recognize the importance of both of these processes in driving down costs over the long term. But over time, we would expect that learning by doing would actually dominate. And this leads us to ask how sweet spots in the near term can be identified and supported and linked together to achieve the cost and performance improvements that we need. So, as I said earlier, I'll be focusing in this presentation on CO2 capture rather than transport and storage for time purposes. And the first thing that I'd like to point out is that in CO2 capture, just like in the other areas, we're already relatively well advanced. I think this is illustrated well by this table. And so we can note that CO2 capture is really not a new process. Today's leading technology, which is amine, the use of amine solvents for CO2 capture, has been commercially used since the 1970s at pretty large scales. And we say that initially, the low cost of CO2 capture from the gas sweetening process allowed it to be used to produce CO2 that could be sold for the cost that EOR operators were willing to pay. And that covered the cost of CO2 capture. CO2 sales into other specific markets have supported CO2 capture projects from coal and gas combustion, which is actually a more challenging form of CO2 capture because the CO2 concentrations are lower. And that's been going on since the 1970s, but at smaller scales initially, gradually getting bigger. And it's fairly clear to those of us that have been involved in the sector that over the last 2 decades, much of the focus has changed towards the climate challenge. And to address the climate challenge, much larger volumes need to be captured and much lower costs are needed for CCS to be able to compete against other mitigation options and keep climate mitigation costs relatively manageable. And the good news from this story is that there's actually some success to report. And the success is that CO2 separation energy from flue gases has been halved since around 1990, as the technology has been increasingly targeted towards climate change mitigation purposes. As this chart shows, we're now in a period of what you might consider to be relatively incremental improvements towards a level of around 2 gigajoules per ton of CO2 captured. And that's just the energy that's required for separating the CO2 from the flue gas, and it's mostly related to the regeneration of a solvent that is primarily water-based. So the message is, worth reiterating, that we're clearly not starting from scratch with CO2 capture technologies, but we are just starting a period of reaching some of the higher scales necessary for widespread CO2 mitigation. That's especially true in the electricity sector and for combustion processes. So I thought it was worth highlighting that we actually have a number of large projects that have taken investment decisions in the capture of CO2 at a level of around 1 million tons of CO2 per year or more. And that gives us the opportunity to look at what has underpinned these investment decisions. What we might say, what has actually created the sweet spots for these to go ahead. And I think it was worth noting when I was preparing these slides that I think 7 out of 9 of these projects are currently under construction and expected to start within the next 18 months. This is very much a live sector, despite the fact that Schleicher in the top left has been going for over 20 years now. So we looked at 14 different projects around the world, and we wanted to ask, what do we know about existing plants that have invested in CCS technologies? And there seem to be a number of common features. One was the certainty of fossil fuel value, the opportunity for the continued use of export of local fossil fuel resources. Another was a good understanding of local geology, geology that would be attractive for CO2 storage and the available expertise to make use of that. Another was that there was actually a sustainable market opportunity beyond technology demonstration. And you'll notice that in this presentation I haven't really used the word demonstration to describe these large projects, because really what we're talking about when we're talking about sweet spots are factors that drive almost commercial type of investments in plants that can run for for 10, 20 years, maybe longer, rather than what might be considered to be experiments with a limited lifetime. The real transfer of funding sources to the private sector will come from these sustainable opportunities and the growth in these market opportunities. So also the low political and low risk political and social environment has been important, and a range of other criteria there. And in the book we discuss these in some more detail, but I think that these are things that policymakers would be very wise to look at when they're looking at how to incentivize CO2 projects in the different sectors that they're looking at for their strategic benefit. Now, we took a closer look at the power sector in the book, and so I'm briefly putting up this slide which shows some of the assumptions that underpin the model on the very left-hand side, and the evolution of costs due to learning in the model as you move to the right-hand side of those charts. And we see that the capital cost premium and the efficiency penalty both decline. And one of the conclusions that we reached for the power sector was that actually to follow this trajectory for the efficiency penalty, this potential floor of around 2 gigajoules per ton of CO2 of separation energy from amine-based capture technologies may actually be insufficient to keep us on the cost reduction path that we need. Obviously that depends on how fuel prices evolve. And so we looked at a range of other technologies for post-combustion, the ones that are coming up the hill, if you like, the slope of technology development that I showed earlier, and to see that there is actually a relatively large potential for innovation in CO2 capture in the power sector. We weren't able to conclude concretely, unfortunately, that any of these technologies were in any sense better than the others or more suitable for particular applications, because we're mostly at a pilot stage and we're very curious to see how the different technologies will compete against each other. But they each offer some advantages in terms of reducing capital costs, reducing the efficiency penalty, or in fact reducing the requirements for the compression of CO2 before it is transferred to a CO2 pipeline. And I've categorized these into post-combustion capture technologies and alternative power generation cycles, because there's actually two applications that we can look at for CCS in the power sector. One relies on the fact that over 400 gigawatts of new coal-fired power plants came into operation between 2010 and 2014. And so if we're on a 2-degree pathway, there's a huge opportunity to retrofit plants. And retrofitting plants in the power sector and in other industrial sectors requires really post-combustion capture technologies. But these alternative power generation cycles listed here offer the opportunity to reduce overall costs, but they require the construction in most cases of new build plants, and so not as suitable for retrofitting. There will be a need, we think, for both of those in their turn. So after that brief tour of CO2 capture in the power sector, and my clear encouragement for you to go and read more in the book, we can move on to the final section, which is the key findings that we found in the book, which summarize what I've just written and point to some other interesting aspects. And the first of these is that, to reiterate a point, in the 2-degree scenario that we ran, almost 6 billion tons of CO2 per year are captured and stored by 2050 in all sectors, and that's in the lowest cost mitigation scenario to 2 degrees. We also would note that the different technologies in CCS by themselves are not new, but the CCS deployment has recently begun in what we can call sweet spots, where policies and strategic local and commercial interests align. I think that the key message towards policymakers is that finding the ways in which those things can be made to align strategically for their benefits is of crucial importance. The third point is that in the power sector, after the opening of Boundary Dam Unit 3, learning by doing is well underway, but the cost gap needs to be still closed by determined parallel action in both technology development and market creation. I can't stress the importance of market creation enough. We would also highlight the fact that post-combustion technologies will continue to be of key importance alongside other technologies that optimize the overall power cycle. But post-combustion technologies can be used in different industrial applications as well as in the power sector, and so they have transfer potential for knowledge spillovers in innovation speak. And the final thing is related to CO2 storage, and I haven't touched on that in this presentation, but that innovation is still a key aspect, along with robust regulation, to keep CO2 storage costs as a minor cost component compared to capture costs. The final thing that I will close with is our list of opportunities for policy action in CCS to keep us online with the 2DS. It won't surprise you to learn that I would propose active support for 3 areas. That's learning by doing in commercial scale projects, learning by researching in labs and networks, but also policy measures that shape the markets to stimulate innovation and sustain sweet spots. Those are the longer term climate policy measures. I think the second point really goes to the sweet spots again, the sectors and regions where costs can both be most easily borne. From a systems planner perspective, that's the key aspect that we looked at. And the other opportunities policy action here relate to where you could target public R&D investment and also take portfolio approaches to innovation to keep a diverse set of technology options open along the chain. And that in the context of this important year in COP21, we concluded that UNFCCC backing for funds and opportunities for CCS can actually make a major contribution here to stimulating activity. And on that point, I will hand back to the chair and obviously open to questions now or later.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. And yes, a very interesting presentation. And we do have a number of questions, but just in the interest of time, we're going to take those at the end of the webinar question period, which will follow after the next presentation. So thank you very much on that. And I think it's definitely the covering of this topic and one of your points at the end where this is an important technology, especially post-combustion side of things for the industrial sector, is a good segue into the next presentation, Global Innovation for More Sustainable Industry. And we're going to hear from Araceli Fernandez. And I think this is a really interesting topic because I think many people, myself included, can sometimes forget about the industrial sector, but it is so important on such a grand scale to whether you live in a house or you drive on a road or a bridge that involves concrete. The role of industrial products play an important part of all our lives, no matter what your position is on sustainable energy, and therefore it's such an important topic to be covered. So, Araceli, I look forward to hearing your presentation on this.
Thanks, David, and hi everyone in the audience. So I'm just going to cover the analysis that we undertook on the industrial area for the ETP 2015 topic, really focusing on innovation. So I'll start by really putting it as a first slide, the key findings that we had through that analysis. Basically, what the analysis showed was that process innovation, specifically directed to low carbon technologies, was really playing a key role in the 2 degrees environment. And especially non-OECD countries were having a pivotal role that I will explain later on.
But some of the main innovation streams that we identify were related to integrating CCS, as Simon has been explaining in the previous session. That has really an important contribution to reduce emissions in the industrial sector. But also there are a lot of streams looking at innovative ways of improving resource efficiency and reducing industrial waste within the process and with additional or neighboring industrial processes, but also how to diversify the applications for industrial products that are produced today in innovative ways. But then, of course, how to tackle all these innovation streams and make them successful. There are significant challenges to overcome. And some of them are mainly related to economic and policy uncertainty. Also, some of the needs about how to manage risk associated to innovative processes, but also how to make a good balance between balancing collaboration and the protection of knowledge. Then finally, we touch on the area of how to measure industrial innovation. And we find also here important challenges into the existing statistics and metrics for it that I'll describe later on. And basically, we've concluded that really it's quite hard with today's regular statistics to, let's say, assess the performance of the innovation process in the industrial sectors. So let me start with some definitions from the analysis that we undertook. Basically, we'll be talking about process and product innovation. And both concepts are interdependent in the sense that product innovation often spurs process modifications, while innovative processes may require the development of new materials or may generate useful byproducts or upstream industry development. So within the broader concept of industrial innovation, we can create or define like a subset, what we call innovation for sustainable industry, which really refers to new processes that directly reduce the environmental impact of manufacturing activities, or to new products that indirectly enable a reduction of energy consumption or CO2 emissions. But also new uses for existing products. For instance, in the case of Canada, craft market pulp mills are being converted to produce dissolving pulp for the textile industry. So we're looking here at how the, let's say, typical uses for industrial products can be diversified to enable benefits on a system basis. However, the two concepts of industrial innovation per se and low carbon innovation in industry are also interlinked in some cases. So for instance, we could see that industrial innovation aimed at reducing emissions can also improve productivity and competitiveness by developing more selective processes with reduced energy costs. An example for this could be, for instance, a naphtha catalytic cracking process for olefin production, which enables from a 10 to 20% energy savings compared to the regular used steam cracking. But it also provides a greater overall light olefin conversion yields because it has a greater selectivity. So both benefits here are shown with the same process, which means that both concepts are interrelated, and this poses additional challenges into how to identify specific drivers that can really push the industrial innovation process towards sustainability. So we explore a little bit the results from the ECP 2015 analysis, and we compare the 6 degrees and the 2 degree scenario trajectories in terms of direct CO2 emissions on the industrial sector. We are showing here the two graphs with the low and high demand variants. And just to explain this, for people not very familiar with the ECP numbers, we, under the industrial analysis, we tend to run two variants for material demand activity to have some sensitivity to compensate for the uncertainty of projecting in the longer term material demand. So normally there is around between a 15 and 35% difference on the material demand activity level between the two variants. So in this case, we can see here results from the overall industrial sector showing that there has to be a great contribution of different measures to reduce the industrial emissions, in which energy efficiency, fuel and feedstock switching and recycling have a really important role. However, in the longer term, really to meet the degree of reduction needed in the 2 degrees environment, innovative processes need to be deployed throughout the production stock globally. And we are referring by innovative processes to processes that are not, haven't been, let's say, commercially demonstrated today. Those reductions related to innovative processes represent around 30% of the CO2 emission reductions from direct emissions in the industrial sector needed by 2050 in the 2-degree scenario. And as I mentioned earlier on, non-OECD countries have a really pivotal role in this reduction effort. They account for almost 75% of the global direct CO2 emissions reduction from innovative industrial processes in 2050 in this 2 degrees environment. As their material demand and share of global markets rise, these countries hold the highest potential for new low-carbon industrial processes. But yet they start from a challenging resources and capacity position, implying greater need for international cooperation and technology transfer. Even nowadays, with the slowing down of the Chinese economy, where the cement and the steel sector are expected to peak their production by 2020, we still see that the non-OECD countries as a whole have greatest potential for industrial material demand activity growth in the future. For instance, the Middle East, Africa, and other Asia, excluding China, in that region, cement production is expected to double by 2050, and steel production is expected to be sixfold by 2050. So that's why, I mean, one of the main reasons why this high demand activity level poses an important potential for deploying innovative processes, because mainly in economies where a more stable demand industrial activity is expected, there will be greater challenges of retrofitting existing stock to implement or deploy innovative processes, because this can create bottlenecks upstream in the site. It could lead to constraints in terms of space availability in the site as well. So there's additional complications to that. In this presentation, I just wanted to go into a bit more detail on two of the energy-intensive sectors that we've analyzed in the division, and that would be iron, steel, and cement. So just by starting with iron steel, we can see here again the two low and high demand variance results comparing CO2 emissions in 6 degrees and 2 degrees. So in the 2 degrees direct CO2 emissions in the iron steel sector, they are 55% lower in 2050 than in the 6 degrees, even though that global crude steel production is likely to grow by almost 50%. As I mentioned, non-OECD countries play a key role in this growth. Emissions can be significantly reduced globally by improving energy efficiency, phasing out outdated technologies, switching existing processes to a lower carbon fuel, for instance, by switching coal to gas-based direct reduced iron, and recycling more steel to increase the availability of scrap. However, even of those, all those measures can again help to reduce those emissions, there's still a gap from the 2 degrees trajectory, and this gap is around 35% by 2050, which needs to be covered really by deploying innovative processes. Low carbon innovation efforts in the iron steel sector focus on increasing the energy efficiency of existing processes and integrated carbon capture in different processes routes. These are some of the main innovative low carbon technology options at pilot phase in the sector. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, and just trying to put some of the main examples that we looked at in the analysis. In here we are showing different, let's say, process routes and principle-based processes. So for instance, blast furnace top gas recovery that will be redirecting some of the blast furnace gas recovered on the top of the blast furnace after separating the CO2 back to the furnace for reducing purposes. The Ulcored process is a DRI-based process. HySarna is a smell reduction-based process, and again, these two would incorporate the carbon capture process. And coke oven gas reforming is a process which mainly is aimed at increasing the hydrogen content through reforming of the coke oven gas, which is a side or off gas producing coke ovens, to be used for reducing purposes again of iron ore for the production of pig iron, and this could be used in either blast furnace processes or smelter reduction processes as well. There are also electricity-based process concepts that have been also been proven at commercial experimental phase. But the role of innovative iron steel processes in the 2 degrees strongly depends on technology characterization parameters. such as expected commercial availability, CO2 process footprint, related investment costs, and local conditions. And thus, the 2 degrees least cost technology pathway is significantly sensitive to how innovation progresses in the sector in the medium term. The sector is also exploring ways of reducing waste gases produced in blast furnaces or in basic oxygen furnaces, or through other processes, through the different process routes available. For instance, commercial processes already exist to use coke oven gas that was mentioned before for the production of methanol. One case could be the Chinese deployment, where already 4 megatons of the national production of methanol are based on this process. Innovative and high value-added products, which are gaining relevance as a strategic choice for companies, offer also further opportunities to reduce CO2 emissions in other sectors, such as transport, buildings, and energy supply, by providing enhanced characteristics such as better resistance to corrosion at high temperature and improved electromagnetic properties that increase final equipment performance. If we now move to the cement sector, and we show similar comparisons, we can see that with a global cement production expected to increase by 17% by 2050, the sector will need to implement a range of measures to achieve the CO2 emission reductions in the 2 degrees. Cement producers can increase energy efficiency by reducing thermal and electricity intensities to approach dry process best available technology performance levels. They can also maximize the substitution of clinker, which is an intermediate product for cement, and they can replace current fuels with low carbon fuel mixes. However, these measures, along with plant heat integration, can save around 473 megatons of direct CO2 emissions, which represents around 21% of the current direct CO2 emissions of the sector. However, still, this is again the case where these emission reductions are not enough for the 2 degrees trajectory, which requires further emission reductions, so that it will be crucial to demonstrate and implement low carbon technologies, especially the incorporation or the integration of CCS into the process. Such technologies allow around 467 megatons of CO2 to be captured globally by 2050 in the 2 degrees, which represents about half of the emission reductions effort required. And you could see quite a significant difference in the contribution of the deployment of innovative processes in this sector versus the aerospace sector. And one of the main reasons behind this is because the cement making process produces a significant amount of process emissions that cannot be reduced by definition through energy efficiency, because they are basically generated through the chemical reactions needed for the production of cement. Innovative technologies that could improve the sustainability of the cement sector focus on direct carbon capture and reducing the thermal intensity of cement production. These are some of the main innovative low carbon technology options and at pilot phase in the sector. Again, not an exhaustive list as it was in the previous case. The contribution of carbon capture processes in the 2 degrees hinges on factors such as technology readiness, relative investment costs, ease of implementation in existing plants, emission reduction potentials, and local conditions, such as energy prices, etc. The 2 degrees least cost trajectory will be influenced by the evolution of these innovative applications in the medium term. So that would, even if partial oxyfueling has a lower capture rate than post-combustion within the analysis we undertook, this capture option is found more cost competitive in the 2 degrees. However, there would be other considerations that may limit the real uptake of this technology within a 2 degrees environment, such as the need for equipment reengineering compared with a less disruptive end-of-the-pipe installation required for post-combustion capture. In the cement sector, as in other sectors, low-carbon products may offer opportunities to reduce CO2 emissions. Some cement companies are developing low-carbon cements with properties similar to those of ordinary Portland cement. For instance, combining no-carbonate raw materials with CO2 absorption and the use of low-carbon fuels could even lead to the production of carbon-negative cement. So if we move now to the area of how to measure industrial innovation, we can see that this is quite of a challenging process. It involves monitoring resources dedicated to innovation activities as inputs, resulting developments as outputs, but also how these are interrelated, looking at the performance and effectiveness of this process. Input-based indicators include the spending on innovation activities or the number of employees involved, among others. Some examples of output-based indicators refer to the number and size of pilots or demonstration projects and business value-added gain from a new product. I'm sorry. Okay, here you go. And finally, performance indicators are difficult to define because of the time lag between innovative activities, let's say inputs, and the results that they generate. That would be the outputs. An example could be business value added achieved by introducing a new product in the market over the investment required to develop and commercialize it. However, performance indicators are useful to assess the effectiveness of innovation, but their usefulness for cross-sectorial comparative analysis is limited, and they depend on sector-specific characteristics. There are official data available for some of these indicators, but their limited coverage of countries and time spans undermines their usefulness for comparative analysis. Input-based data include R&D spending or R&D spending intensity, which is the ratio of R&D spending over the total sales or business value added. And these indicators have a limited scope as they refer only to the R&D phases of innovation process and not to the demonstration and deployment. Output-based data include patent counts and patent citations and new products, but these also present limitations as they monitor only the final results and not results at the different stages of the innovation process. Official data provide no information on the performance or efficiency of innovation itself. And then if we think about how to measure sustainability-oriented industrial innovation or low-carbon innovation, as we've been calling it through the analysis, this poses even additional challenges, stemming from the fact that it's difficult to segregate the low-carbon RDDD&D from broader industrial innovation because they are interrelated, as we mentioned before. Despite the limitations of input-based indicators, they do shed some light on how innovation is spread across regions and sectors. For instance, we are comparing here 2000 and 2011 R&D spending in OECD countries and in China. And here we can see that R&D spending as a group on these countries grew by 10% from 2000 to 2011, looking at the compound annual growth rate. Where in China, for instance, it experienced a greater overall growth with an R&D expenditure growing by 22% since 2000. The distribution of business R&D expenditure among the selected industrial sectors is similar throughout OECD countries, with chemicals and petrochemicals standing out as the major investor in innovation. However, the sectorial mix differs in China, where the chemicals and petrochemical sector still provides the greatest contribution, but the basic metal sector almost reaches a third of the industrial R&D expenditure by 2011, and this is mainly due to the significant growth of the activity in that sector in China during that period. Within the 2,000 companies that invest the most in innovation, R&D spending patterns differ from sector to sector. In terms of R&D spending as a share of sales, chemical companies spend 5 times as much as companies in other sectors globally. However, this is different on a region-by-region basis. This difference can be greater in countries or in regions like Europe and the United States, which is like 6 times greater, but it could be lower 2 to 4 times in India, Japan, and Korea, showing the different distribution in investments throughout the sectors regionally. It's also outstanding that the equipment manufacturing sector has quite a relative high R&D investment intensity compared to other sectors, which partially explains why there is a lower R&D intensity in other energy-intensive process that may rely on upstream equipment needs. Also to mention that the high R&D intensity seen in the chemicals sector is significantly pushed by the high intensity of the pharmaceuticals sector, which is a subsector within that one. Industrial innovation faces different interlinked challenges. They mainly refer to uncertainty, economic and policy outlooks, the need to manage risk, and the need to balance collaboration with protection of knowledge. Low-carbon industrial innovation can face additional challenges, such as the difficulty of penetrating a market dominated by a small number of widely used process technologies, and also technologies that require new infrastructure, as is the case of CCS, referring to transport and storage facilities. They face particular hurdles. Industry operating margins fluctuate depending on several factors, such as energy prices, product demand, feedstock availability, labor and environmental compliance, etc., but also the tradability of a specific material, for instance. If we look at energy prices, we could see that, for instance, industries in regions with higher volatile energy prices may find it more attractive to invest in the short and medium term in energy efficiency measures to reduce energy costs and the exposure to volatile energy markets. Conversely, investing in innovation tends to have longer economic benefits. Even if where penalties for CO2 emissions exist, they are regional rather than global, and they are likely to remain at different levels in different regions. Most of the sectors that we've discussed today, and they are more discussed in more detail in the book, you can consult that analysis, they are exposed to international trade. So a carbon pricing policy aimed at encouraging the support of the progress of industrial innovation under those conditions may instead lead to the relocation of production. So without a clear idea of when climate policies might make low carbon production globally competitive and widespread, companies may find it difficult to justify investments in pilot and demonstration projects in the near term. Risk is inherent to innovation projects. They aim to develop and deploy basically completely new processes or products or new uses for those products. While uncertainty intensity decreases as the innovation advances, capital intensity tends to increase mostly because of the gradual process being scaled up. A decision to invest in innovation hinges on what balance between uncertainty intensity and capital intensity the investor can be able to accept. Risk mitigating mechanisms can help to promote investment in low carbon innovation by providing funding or preferential loans and helping also leveraging investments from other sources. There are several characteristics that we identify through the analysis that could maximize the impact of this type of mechanisms. For instance, by developing transparent selection criteria to assess project candidatures and minimize bureaucracy, and also creating dynamic and results-oriented mechanisms to set intermediate technical milestones along the innovation process, the completion of which unlocks shares of total allocated financial support. Also, by targeting innovation processes instead of innovation providers. This means that in that case, governments can maintain a greater ownership of the mechanism impact, basically with this results-oriented approach, and mitigate the investment risks. Balancing a wide scope without losing effectiveness to direct resource towards industrial innovation streams with greater potential for sustainability improvements while maintaining some diversity in low carbon routes. And finally, also targeting a wide deployment of developed and demonstrated process technologies or products by selecting projects linked with technology deployment and transfer. Collaborative relationships can accelerate innovation while increasing the chances that a technology will be adopted more widely. On the other hand, competition can also boost innovation because companies know that introducing a new development in the market can give them provide them a commercial advantage. However, collaboration and competition in many cases run into conflict. Public-private partnerships can help solving this challenge and mitigate other barriers to new industrial developments, such as high risk, by establishing investment sharing mechanisms. Involving stakeholders from the whole product value chain facilitates the development of integrated low-carbon solutions and enable better alignment of public-private sustainability goals in the support for industrial innovation. But also PPPs can benefit from maximize impact by having a long-term vision on their members' engagement, and also benefit from a systemic approach by having a multi-sectorial collaboration structure. So just to summarize some of the policy opportunities identified through those learnings and analysis, basically the first point is that by designing a stable long-term and low-carbon strategies that are aligned internationally, governments can reduce risks and valorize a reduction of the environmental impact of industrial activity. These strategies should be supported by measures such as long-term, legally binding greenhouse reduction targets and stable continuous carbon pricing mechanisms. However, in parallel, it's also needed that governments implement transparent and results-oriented mechanisms for reducing risk for investors in innovative low-carbon industrial technologies. And these mechanisms should be linked to the long-term low-carbon strategies to make sure that the whole package is complementary, but also should include specific market creation measures to promote the uptake of low-carbon technologies shortly after their demonstration. The prioritization of the focus areas for innovation in industry should be really aligned in close collaboration with government and industry. And that could be done through cooperative innovation frameworks that adequately balance cross-sectorial and international collaboration along product value chains. So I think I'm going to leave it here for the moment, and then I'm happy to take any questions now or after the next session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Araceli. I think one of the things that struck me with this chapter is that the innovation needed in an industry really needs to be almost global today. It is a very challenging area, both from a competitive point of view, both within a given company, but also on a global level. So thank you for that presentation. One of the questions that has come through is, are you seeing significant innovation in industry, in the cement sector, for instance? Are you seeing them deploying innovative processes?
Thanks, David. Well, some of the main innovation streams we've seen on the cement sector relate more to really looking at pilot demonstration of integration of carbon capture within the process. If we consider the main processes existing for cement making, we're really looking at two main processes, wet and dry process, depending on the moisture content of the raw materials. And really, the state-of-the-art technology is really looking at dry-based process, including pre-calciner and including different stages for preheating the raw materials. So in that sense, there is a trend of sites and certainly new capacity moving towards that level of energy performance. But as we've shown in the analysis, there's a need of further reductions, even if we will reach that level in the 2 degrees environment. And that brings us to the challenge of how we could reduce the process emissions that are generated in that process making. So in that sense, that's why, one of the options is really looking at carbon capture, and in there's different activities looking at different capture options. In the analysis, we looked in more detail at post-combustion and also oxy-fueling, specifically partial oxy-fueling, looking at the pre-calciner emissions. But certainly, there are also other streams more related to how we could tackle the root cause of the process emissions, which is trying to produce what we call this low-carbon cement, which some of them are based on non-carbonate raw materials. And in there, the activity is a bit heterogeneous. Some companies have been doing some work in developing this, let's say, innovative cement products, but we have to wait and see how this evolves in the future and how really those type of alternative cements can really reach the markets on a high scale.
Great, thank you. Well, we may have more questions coming forward in the Q&A, and actually we do have a couple on deck. But I want to go to our last presentation, and I think it was a good segue from the industry presentation to this, again emphasizing the importance of emerging economies that play in the role of the future sustainable energy systems and their impact on the global climate agenda. So I want to turn it over to Daniele Poponi, who is the current project manager of the ETP process and who was indeed very helpful and instrumental in ETP 2015 as well. So Daniele, please go ahead on this.
Thank you, David. It was a great pleasure working with you, indeed. So the aim of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of 2 chapters of ETP 2015 report, namely low carbon innovation in emerging economies and energy technology innovation in China. So these 2 chapters will be presented in more detail during the webinar that is scheduled for October 16, to which you are all invited to participate. All regions of the world have a role to play in making the 2DS possible, as David mentioned. Solutions to enable innovation to contribute in delivering the 2DS will depend on local conditions, and as national circumstances and resources will drive different solutions and pathways. It is important to understand not only what the contribution of innovation could be to decarbonize the energy system, but where innovative energy technologies will be deployed. By 2050, nearly 75% of annual reduction need to come from non-OECD countries. The regional technology shares in primary energy supply in the 2DS, as you see in the figure, show a strong variation among regions, and emerging economies have both different starting points, different pathways, and different end solutions to meeting climate goals. This variety of solutions is good news for emerging economies so that they can develop technologies where they can have a competitive advantage and helping these countries to develop their own decarbonization strategies. And the growing demand for energy and the infrastructure needed to provide it creates a unique opportunity for emerging economies to reduce CO2 emissions by deploying innovative low-carbon technology. During infrastructure build-out, emerging economies can be early movers in applying a system approach to the rollout of advanced low-carbon technologies. And in fact, local innovation capacity in emerging economies is key to the 2DS, and industrial and emerging economies need to work together to ensure that solutions can be deployed. And the second important point is that the build-up of innovation capacity in emerging countries can be supported with a variety of means, acting at different stages of the technology cycle, as you see in the figure. And growing dynamic energy markets provide the most conducive environment for energy innovation. And on top of that, international cooperation on energy technology innovation with and among emerging economies has value and could contribute to accelerate decarbonization while providing economic benefits to all. So, and I would like to stress out that there are examples of success stories out there, including South-to-South joint technology cooperation efforts. Now moving to China. China is poised to become the global leader in R&D spending. This momentum could provide a huge opportunity for the low-carbon transition at a global scale if more innovative energy technologies can be developed in China and deployed globally. So with the growth of innovation capacity, China's manufacturing base and technology deployment have been evolving from low-cost made in China to designed and made in China and deployed in China and beyond. Just to mention a few figures, in 2012, China's R&D intensity, its R&D funding as a proportion of GDP, matched that of the European Union for the first time. Perhaps more significant is the rapid rate of advance. From 2000 to 2012, China's funding for science and technology doubled from 0.9% to 1.98%, while EU funding rose more modestly from 1.75% to 1.98%. China's R&D intensity climbed to 2.8% in 2013 with funding of USD 192 billion, up USD 25 billion from 2012. And as a sign of their dominant role in innovation, enterprises took 76% of the total R&D input. Based on projection from the OECD, this trajectory is likely to continue to 2020, with China overtaking the United States, the present global leader in R&D, by 2019. China's energy policies will be a key driver to making the 2DS possible. The ETP 2015 report in its 2DS scenario sets an ambitious scenario for China, reducing annual emissions by over 10 gigatons of CO2 by 2050 compared with the business as usual. It should be noted that this is the most ambitious reduction path for China among other scenarios developed from the Energy Research Institute and the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. To cut CO2 emissions in 2050 by half compared with 2012 levels would be an enormous challenge for China, but achievable with the contribution of strong policies encouraging energy technology innovation. Now, as we look at these and other indicators of innovation, and more specifically clean energy innovation in China, it is important to understand the context of innovation with Chinese characteristics. Broadly, this emphasizes the role of developing local innovation capacity and domestic innovation, as well as integrating expertise and innovation from abroad. China promotes its own domestic innovation capacity through different avenues. First-of-a-kind invention, meaning 100% domestic, integrating new design features into global leading technologies, and optimizing or adapting for China's local context. So these various approaches play out, and we see the output of innovative activity estimated by sector indicators, including metrics related to patent developments and high-tech exports, along with the funding of and R&D intensity. So these are both input and output indicators and need to be taken as a whole to paint a full picture of innovation system performance. China's innovation progress may also be illustrated by the increase in its share of solar power and led global exports, which rose from less than 10% in 2001 to almost 40% in 2014. So this trend has correlated closely with the substantial increase in patent development over the same period. So as China continues to move up the value chain, advanced technology and innovative systems, challenges and opportunities brought on by the shifting technology transfer and the fusion landscape will affect both the import and export of technologies from China. So the conclusion is that ultimately the ability of China to develop and deploy innovative low-carbon technologies can make the 2DS more feasible, not only domestically in China, but also at a global level, given the significant export capabilities of Chinese companies. Now, before I conclude, I would like to invite you all to explore the online dataset of our ETP report. If you purchase or will purchase the ETP report, you will have access to a very rich dataset which will comprise not only the data underlying all figures that you see in the report, but also different metrics such as primary energy demand, final energy demand in different end-use sectors, buildings, transport, and industry, carbon emissions, and or for instance, the electricity generation mix for the main regions and countries in the world, and also for 3 different scenarios, the 6DS scenario, which is our baseline scenario, the 4DS, and 2DS scenarios. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Daniele. And we have a number of questions coming in yet, and so I look forward to this part where we can open it up to dig into a few items yet. I want to reach out to, well, Araceli as a starting point on the industry side. Can you speak to the role of CO2 use when you talked about it in industry? Often it's talking just about EOR applications. Is there broader applications that you're seeing in the industrial sector?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, there's certain industrial sectors where CO2 utilization is regularly used, let's say, and deployed. I mean, we could name the food and beverage, but also, for instance, urea making process for fertilizers. So basically, in the analysis, what we do is we monitor these activities But we have to bear in mind that we cannot really compare CO2 utilization with the discussions we're having about carbon capture, in the sense that, I mean, using CO2 and locking it within a product wouldn't necessarily mean that it's going to be locked permanently, as we would be expecting in a more permanent storage location. So in terms of their impact into the mitigation of or reduction of CO2 emissions in the industrial sector within the 2 degrees, we have to bear that in mind. But we certainly do monitor those activities within our industrial modeling. And for instance, one of the activities we started to undertake last year was the conversion of the ATP industry model to a new platform to be based on times, which is an optimization modeling software developed by one of the implementing agreements of the IEA called SAP. And basically, this framework would enable us to have a better visibility on the least cost technology transition for the 2 degrees trajectory. And we are taking that chance to really improve the, let's say, monitoring capability we have on those activities, especially on the petrochemical sector and chemical sector, as I mentioned, related to the manufacturing of fertilizers. And then what would be the impact of releasing that CO2 back to the atmosphere once these fertilizers are, let's say, basically hydrated once they are used. So basically, to respond, I mean, we do monitor those activities, but certainly, I mean, the differences with the discussions on CCS have to be well understood, and they need to be put in the right context.
Great. Great, thank you for answering that. Now, one of the panel or the attendees has asked for a bit more on deeper on carbon costs required to make CCS feasible. And what I wanted to add to that question, so Simon Bennett, if you could comment on that. But I would also like to say to position this as a question where, you know, we've seen significant renewable energy costs come down, and you know, what kind of pressures are you seeing for CCS coming from renewables? And I'm also, so I'd like you to answer that, just a little bit more information about how CO2 costs are required to make CCS feasible and the pressures you're feeling from renewable. And I'm going to come back with another question to you, Simon Mueller, kind of the contrary, your perspectives on CCS from as a renewable energy expert. So first, Simon Bennett.
Thanks, David. Well, this is the multi-billion-dollar question, I suppose, is what carbon price would lead to widespread investment in CCS, and it's a question that actually isn't adequately answered by our modeling perspective, because you don't get one single answer for this. It really depends on fuel costs. It depends on where you are in the world, and it depends perhaps crucially on which sector you're thinking of applying CCS to. So if I start with the sectors, we actually see relatively competitive CO2 mitigation costs, even today almost in sectors such as natural gas processing, hydrogen generation, where we know that those processes, the operators of those processes can capture their CO2, and they can sell that CO2 to the operators of enhanced oil recovery operations for the costs that EOR operators are willing to pay, which are not, they're not astronomical costs. They pay competitive prices, and so that gives us a good indication that the cost of capture for CCS or cost of capture in those sectors is probably in the range of $10 to $25 per ton even today. Now, when we look at sectors where the energy requirements for capturing the CO2 are somewhat higher and the processes are more complicated, in the 2DS, it's worth pointing out that our carbon cost by 2030 is in the range of $80 to $100 per ton on a global average, and we get significant uptake of CCS at that level, compared to the 4DS where the cost is $20 to $40 and there's very little uptake of CCS, especially in the power sector. So you're probably looking at a range like that in accordance with our assumptions on technology evolution. I think you'd be talking about higher than $100 per ton in the power sector today, partly because the price that you would need to pay through a politically constructed CO2 market would need to also account for the project risk of developing a first-of-a-kind project, the project risk of exploring and developing the storage site and testing the regulations there. So it's difficult to put one single figure on it, and I do stress that this is very different for different sectors. Now, the second question that you asked was about whether the CCS sector is feeling pressure from renewables. And I would say that if we go back to the point that in the long term, CCS has a huge role to play in industrial sectors, the industrial sectors that Araceli was talking about, in most of those situations there isn't direct competition between CCS and renewable energies for mitigation. So I don't think that that has been a major factor. If you look at the power sector, the experience with renewables over the past 5 years or so has really shaken, I think, some of the foundations of the projections for how much CCS might develop in the near term. So there has been learning on CCS costs as some of the early projects have been developed and deployed, but that has not shown us that costs are coming radically down. In fact, in some cases, the costs are higher than were anticipated 5 years ago. So the lack of deployment has stymied cost development, while the costs of renewable energy technologies have clearly declined. So the prospects for CCS in the short term have perhaps become more realistic in line with our long-term projections, but the prospects for CCS in the long term in the power sector, where it provides a different service, where it's not a variable form of power generation, but it's hopefully a dependable and dispatchable form, those prospects have not really diminished an enormous amount. There's still a lot of CCS perhaps needed in the power sector, and its future will be dependent on fossil fuel prices as well as cost declines in renewables.
Great. Thank you. Now, Simon Mueller, could I get your perspectives on this? And I definitely don't want to start a full argument in the room, but I'm curious if you align largely with Simon Bennett, or if you see things developing a lot different as a renewable energy expert.
Well, I agree with the points that Simon has made fully so far. Maybe to add an angle from the renewable side. I mean, first of all, I think my highest level comment is the less options we have available for decarbonization, and be that for technical, political, or whatever reasons, the more challenging it is, and that's then bad news for the climate, right? And from that perspective, I don't think it really matters if you're working in CCS or renewables, that one should be worried about the slow progress in CCS. I think the uptake of renewables has been motivated by the fact that they're not only a way to mitigate climate change, but that also governments have expected local economic benefits from it, energy security benefits, and so forth. And I think CCS and renewables share the common problem that there's not enough being done by governments to actually constrain carbon emissions and move forward on that. Maybe one point that Simon Bennett mentioned on the role in the power sector, I think there it very much depends what kind of CCS we're speaking about. Essentially, wind and solar generators are part-time workers, and so the flexibility options to integrate them are also operating part-time, stepping in when they're not available and exiting the system when there's a lot of wind and solar. And in that sense, the kind of CCS we need is capital light CCS as much as possible, so focusing on getting down really how much capital we're sinking in the system, and having flexibility in mind when we build CCS. So maybe having one unit that runs baseload with stripping the carbon part away, and then having the combustion process CO2 free, and being able to maybe for some time store the fuel in advance. And then of course it's clear there is a competition with other flexibility options. So if the price of seasonal storage for whatever reason comes down quite dramatically, we could imagine a situation in which decarbonization is possible cost effectively, even in the absence of CCS, although we don't have any indication right now to believe so.
Thank you for those comments, and it's interesting. The work that we do at UNECE does focus around CCS as well, and your argument on the security element I think is very interesting, because there are a number of developing countries who have large indigenous resources of fossil fuels, whether being coal or gas. And one of the arguments that we make within the climate discussion is that we need to have this technology available and accessible, because this will indeed engage with them. If you simply say to them, use renewables and don't use your indigenous resources, there is a concern that they will disengage from the process, which I don't think is helpful on a global basis. So thanks for those comments. I want to follow up on this with Araceli, and do you see good engagement or at least a view to collaboration between other sectors and the industry sector for CCS? Is the industrial sector looking out to what's happening in the electricity sector as to how fast CCS is developing for industry?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, one of the differences is, I think, integrating carbon capture in industrial processes is one of the main, let's say, innovator levers that, we've discussed. But certainly, it's quite different in the sense when talking to the power sector, because when we talk about industry, basically we are considering about how we could, in a way, absorb the equipment that is needed to capture the CO2 embedded in flue gases or in off gases that are emitted in different sources within the specific process. So we are talking really about the process integration issue, which in some cases tend to be more process specific. So even within a specific industrial sector, we'll be talking about differences in the type of, let's say, process modifications that would be required if we're talking about the blast furnace, for instance, or we're talking about the cell reduction process. So it's quite process specific, but having said that, there are still some cross-cutting learnings when it comes to how to improve, let's say, the carbon capture performance itself. That could be learned from sector to sector, especially when we're talking about post-combustion processes. So I think Simon Bennett in his intervention, he put a slide on the thermal need for some of the post-combustion capture techniques. And in this sense, for instance, we'll be talking about the same basic principle. So any innovation or progress in, let's say, reducing that thermal energy requirement, that would be also applicable and could be a benefit for industrial processes, whether if it's driven by the power sector or the industry sector. But there are certainly technology platforms which are cross-sectorial within industrial sectors that looked at innovative technologies, possibly not only about carbon capture, but they incorporate different innovative work streams. So in that sense, we could say that CCS is not like a single topic in industry, but certainly has specific challenges that need to be tackled and well understood on a sector by sector basis. And just getting a little bit back to the price question on CO2 and just reinforcing Simon Bennett's argument about the differences within each of the sectors, it's also important that within a specific sector there's also process differences, and within each process there will be different capture techniques that could be applied. So really, to reinforce the robustness and to have a better visibility on how these different technologies could compete in the future, we'll be looking at whether it could incentivize pilot demonstrations and also techno-economic studies that really assess and capture the performance from an economic and technical perspective of this demonstration, so that we could really see on a case-by-case basis how this could be extrapolated.
Great, thank you for that. And it's interesting when we, the one thing that I'm reflecting on when you bring out the point of finance again, and I'll put this back to Simon Bennett and Simon Mueller. They're both capital-intensive processes, and could you kind of reflect on the different upfront capital, the differences in how upfront capital costs can be managed for renewables versus CCS?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question first. I mean, ultimately, what we need is a mechanism by which we can provide sufficient investment certainty so that you can then have attractive ways to finance the investment. And currently, it's not so much the problem that we wouldn't have the money available that could be unlocked the moment you have the right policies in place. I mean, precisely that's what we're seeing. In countries that manage to provide revenue certainty in a contractual framework that is sound, we see ever improving financing conditions because the sector understands the technology now, and therefore we see low costs of capital and increasing competitiveness and low costs of generating the electricity. And understanding this and translating it into exactly these types of policy, market, and regulatory frameworks that combine revenue certainty and very low remuneration in the end to fully reap the advantages of the technological progress that we've seen. That's what governments should be doing. Although we do see that not all of them stick to this. I mean, one big problem is where governments try to solve old problems via retroactive changes, which then increases the cost of capital and increases the cost of deployment further down the road. That's one of the reasons why having a sound strategic approach to the overall framework for the electricity and wider energy sector is so important. I mean, of course, that does not mean that governments are not allowed to adjust to changing market conditions. It just should be done in a way that is understandable to all the participants in the market and is consistent with a longer-term strategy.
Okay, so let me take that, and because I'm in broad agreement with that, and throw it to Simon Bennett. So when you're looking at, let's say these larger projects, I mean, on a one-off basis, is revenue certainty enough? So for instance, could we apply a CCS FIT type program? Is that sort of the same type of revenue certainty the main item that could solve this upfront cost issue?
Okay, so I'm happy to take that, and we'll talk in the context of the power sector, because that seems to be where we've landed. But I think the first point to make is really that CCS is not a more capital-intensive technology than a coal or gas-fired power plant. In fact, the ratio of capital to operating costs is similar, and perhaps maybe even skewed more towards operational costs, depending on fuel prices, because of the efficiency penalty. What CCS is it's a technology. A CCS-equipped plant is a plant where you pay a premium for removing the CO2 from the generation. So it's an overall more expensive plant. So you would need to cover the difference in costs compared to a situation in which you are still able to build an unabated fossil fuel plant. Obviously, once you're into any kind of commercial deployment, it is revenue certainty is the key thing. What we haven't seen around the world to a large extent is governments coming forward with the types of electricity market support mechanisms that would support a CCS project. I think that we can point to the contracts for difference model in the UK as being one example. And where I talked about the virtuous circle that is the escalator that CCS needs to get on, that's really a reflection of what Simon Mueller was talking about how costs have been driven down by incentive policies in renewables. And we're yet to see whether the policies that have been put forward for CCS are really going to work, and whether they are going to work in combination with other measures in the early stages that reflect some of the higher costs and risks of these first-of-a-kind projects. But if governments can put together packages that do provide revenue certainty, then those are probably the kind of projects that we think are more sustainable, are going to deliver better learning, and are going to get the sector more geared up to provide a CCS service going forwards.
Do you do you see any risk of the money used for CCS taking away for the money for renewables, or vice versa? Do you, as you look across the industry, and sorry, this is both to you and Simon Mueller for now, see any risk of that?
Simon Mueller here, speaking from the renewables perspective. I think if we look at where both markets are now, we're actually looking at quite different capital pools that they're tapping into, right? So, for example, if you have a constructed wind farm, large wind farm, we now see that actually institutional investors such as pension funds will invest in these assets because they guarantee a stable return and the technological risk is well understood. So really, we're looking at capital pools with a low risk, low return profile, very high shares of debt in the financing of projects, and this is really what's giving us part of the very low LCOEs that we've been speaking about today. I think the situation for CCS is radically different in that regard, simply because the technology is far from being at the same level of being proven technically, and therefore also the capital base is quite different, and therefore I wouldn't really see any direct competition on that front. But maybe the other Simon sees it differently.
No, I also don't see direct competition for these particular pools of funding. Some of the CCS projects that we've seen going forwards have, if you take the example of a Boundary Dam, have been from companies that have been able to finance the extensions of fossil fuel assets that they wish to keep operating under a lower emissions scenario. It's not evident that the direct alternative to them would have been a project in the renewable sector. And I will say something about the money that might come from public budgets, because their CCS is still reliant to quite a large extent on money from public budgets, and that money you could see as being in direct competition with renewable energy technologies, but also other other technologies, other opportunities for R&D investment. And so we need to go back to our earlier messages about the importance of keeping a portfolio of options on the table, about the risks of taking any one option off the table, and making sure that the funding that goes to any particular technology that we think is going to be important and highly valuable to a government or globally, and keeping that in proportion to the needs of the technology in the short and the long term. And I think in this regard, CCS has perhaps suffered from some of the nature of the political cycle for releasing funds, and there is clearly a case for more public funding in the near term, but it's I think it's unhelpful to see that as a zero-sum game.
Thank you for that comment. And Araceli, on the industry side, what do you hear from the industrial sector? And you can focus on, say, cement and steel as examples. What do they see as kind of the biggest barriers to moving forward? You've highlighted some of them, but if you could just give, say, the top two for them in deploying low-carbon technologies in their sectors, what would they be?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think, from the challenges that we've discussed, really the uncertainty on the policy and the economic outlook would be the main challenge related to any, development of a new process. Basically looking at, volatile energy prices, not, let's say, regionally coordinated carbon pricing mechanisms, for instance. As we said, we are talking about, in some cases, for some sectors that really produce products that are traded on the global market. So those differences in the environmental compliance costs and energy costs will really have an impact on their competitiveness on the global level. So in some cases, some of these mechanisms For instance, we talk about CO2 pricing that maybe originally intended to really try to incentivize energy efficiency measures and reduce energy consumption and emissions, perhaps through the deployment also of innovative processes, may at the end lead to the relocation of production rather than really a boost of innovation. So really, I think through the analysis and the consultation with industrial experts through the exercise, I mean, when we discuss about challenges, I think the economic and the policy outlook uncertainty is one of the greatest. Because, I mean, there's certainly, a risk in investing in these technologies, but it's directly linked to that uncertainty. So when we talk about capital investments, as long as there's some certainty on the future outlook, that will be mitigated directly. So I would choose that one, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we're coming to the close of our time, and I just wanted to make some closing remarks that I have had over the course of developing this publication. And often I hear challenges to innovation in the energy sector very much compared to the innovation in, say, the electronics sector or the electronics industry. And I think there are many items worth comparing, but there are also other aspects that are not analogous. And we're seeing that really very much in these sectors that were described today. The energy technology that we're seeing, whether it's in industry or power generation, are very long-term, capital-intensive investments. And it's very difficult to ask investors to take big risks with big money when they don't have uncertainty. And I think that really makes this sustainable energy system aspect so complex. Many people look to a simple carbon market as the answer to deploy all these technologies, and we've heard today that that could be difficult when you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in something that's going to last 20 years. What is the carbon price going to be in 20 years? And we don't even know what it's going to be in the next few years. So these are the aspects that I think make the innovation so challenging, in addition to the global nature of trade, for instance, with commodities such as steel. These are going to require strong effort, both from the private sector, from governments, across sectors even, that make the innovation so essential, but also so challenging, so that we can see the energy system that we want in the future. And so I hope that today the discussion helped to bring forward some knowledge and learnings on these aspects, but I think it's very clear that we have a lot of work to do yet, and yet we have some big hopes for the coming months as we lead up to the COP21 negotiations, and I hope we can see a bright future in the sustainable energy system moving forward. So I just want to pass this back over to those in Paris, see if there's any final closing remarks or housekeeping. So please go ahead.
Thank you, David. No final remark, except we would like to thank all the reviewers and all colleagues that attended the workshop we had over the ETP cycle, and most importantly, all colleagues that were with us today. And again, we would like to invite you for the next webinar, which is scheduled for the 16th of October at 10:30 Central European Summer Time. Thank you very much for staying with us today.